Warcraft isn't the same game that it used to be. Since the beginning, WoW has undergone a variety of massive shifts in every facet of the game. The story, the regions and zones, the classes and races, the gear, the servers and guilds, all are different or changed. Fundamentally, the game is still an MMORPG. Players still create and customize their own characters. They still level up, overcome dungeons, fight each other in arenas and battlegrounds, and tackle the challenges inside raids. It's still called WoW, but is it still World of Warcraft, the game that took over the world when it came out 20 years ago? I don't believe so. Let me ask you an important question. I'm no doctor, but I'm going to perform complex surgery to take your heart out of your body and put a different one in there. Are you still you? What if instead I replaced your brain? If someone drops the equivalent of a magical nuclear bomb on the Barrens and it becomes two different zones, is it still the Barrens? There's a thought experiment that originates from ancient Greece called the Ship of Theseus. It's based on a cool story from mythology, but how it started isn't important. Just ignore that, like it's a survival hunter. What's really important is the question it asks. If you replace all of the individual parts of an object over time, is it the same object? World of Warcraft is unique among games in that you can ask this question about it because it has had insane longevity, like a ship that has been docked for centuries. You can't really apply this thought experiment to many other singular titles. Maybe you could argue the case over the entirety of a whole franchise. Series like Halo, Call of Duty, Mario, The Legend of Zelda, or Pokemon have run for decades, but are made up of entirely separate games. That seems more like arguing for a fleet of Theseus rather than a ship. For individual, specific games, the vast majority of them don't have the longevity to undergo an elongated process of piecemeal change. Even in this context, the application isn't perfect. The two best games to try this with are probably League of Legends and World of Warcraft, both of which are live service and undergo nearly constant updates. For both of them, the patch cycle is an understood and accepted part of the playing process. Players need to relearn and adjust their game knowledge in regular intervals. What sets them apart is the yearly seasonal churn in League versus the major expansion drops in Warcraft. Warcraft is different because you can't switch up on the fly if something changes and you dislike modifications to your main class or spec. An ADC player in League can pick Jinx or Varus if Caitlyn is banned, and the game will be over in 30 minutes. But if you've played Hunter going back long enough in WoW, you experienced a major shift in gameplay when they were converted from a mana class to one that uses focus. Demonology Warlock went from a Soulfire spam execute phase in Wrath of the Lich King to literally turning into a demon, then had that ability completely stripped away and given to an entirely different class when Demon Hunters were released. If you ask any longtime player, I would wager that almost 100% of them would tell you that today's Warcraft is not the same game that they first played. So, how did it get to that point? What separates modern WoW from old WoW? Some solutions to the question come to mind immediately, but it's important to recognize that the answer to this thought experiment is going to be highly subjective. Everyone has parts of the game they care about more. You have hardcore raiders.
If any of you is below me on damage, I'm probably just gonna kick you straight out of the guild.
PvPers. Role players.
These are weeds, sir.
Gold farmers, collectors, and casual players who do a little bit of everything. They all started their Warcraft adventure at different points in time. Different priorities means different conceptualizations of what makes WoW. One person might say that replacing the body of a car makes it new, and someone else might say a car is always the same until the engine is changed. So I'm going to start off by suggesting something a little unorthodox. If class identity is very important to you, the dividing line between original and new might be a major update that changes how a specialization works at its baseline. Maybe people who originally played Combat Rogue now believe Warcraft to be fundamentally different because the spec became outlaw and underwent a thematic change to something resembling a pirate. Or were many of them fine with this change to varying degrees, choosing to either stick with it or simply re-roll to something else? Class choice and identity is a significant factor in how players experience the game. For many, it is the first and most important choice for a character, and defines their faction allegiance and race options. It also determines in what ways the player will interact not just with the world and the content within, but also other players. You can play mage, but you will never be a tank. You can play shaman and provide buffs and healing to your teammates. Despite this, I would be surprised to hear that many WoW players would use class updates as evidence that Warcraft is no longer the same game. Much like League and its champion mains, the overall experience does not change much when one spec or character becomes something radically changed or altogether new. No single class update is so revolutionary that it shifts the understanding of the game in total. Rogues are still a stealth-based melee DPS class, with exceptional utility and crowd control. Warwick is still a tanky jungler with strong chase potential and a long, single-target ultimate. For all but the most dedicated class or specialization players, this is likely too granular an option to be a viable answer. Class and spec fantasy is absolutely an important component of WoW, but they are more like real estate fixtures than foundational components that define the game overall. Are there any specs or classes that are so fundamental to Warcraft that a dramatic change would signal the game being completely different to you? Leave a comment below. Okay, so let's replace a different part of the ship and see where we stand. Say a giant evil black dragon emerges from the world and then shatters everything. Nearly every zone in the game is impacted in at least a minor way, but some of them are now radically different. There are also new zones scattered among them. Players can fly in the old world, and the shamanistic cows found God and can be paladins. Cataclysm was appropriately named. Warcraft changed in dramatic and irreversible ways. If you dropped someone who only ever played prior expansions into the updated version of the Barrens, they would be completely lost. Don't forget the massive, seismic change to gearing with the removal of MP5. If you want to argue feel, I think this is as good a place as any to make your stand that WoW became something new. This was a total remodel of the boat. A new layout, a new mast, a new helm, a sparkly new paint job, and some new cabins. For many people, Cataclysm marks a sharp divide between what WoW used to be and what it is now. Among the huge list of changes was the later addition of Looking for Raid, or LFR, which added a mostly trivial raid experience so that all players would be able to participate in the content. Like LFR, another system that changed WoW in a significant way was the Dungeon Finder. Back in the days of yore, people used to have to manually recruit players to go do stuff. Someone in a group would have to stand in a city, spamming chat to find other players to fill out a comp to run dungeons and raids. Personally, this is a nostalgic aspect of old Warcraft. It reminds me of the traditional RPG experience where you head into a town and hit up a message board to grab monster bounties and see which NPCs need an adventurer to run their errands. Needing to put together groups is like a social quest for other players to pick up and join in. The Dungeon Finder was the beginning of a shattering of the most quintessential social aspect of the game. Making it easy and thoughtless for players to get groups streamlined the experience, and in hindsight was probably a necessary modernization. Everything about WoW slows down if you remove this feature, and at this point, it's been in the game longer than it hasn't. Players want to play, not wait around for a tank willing to run through a specific instance. Of course, you don't do this for raid difficulties higher than LFR or for mythic dungeons. But taking this responsibility out of the hands of players began the deconstruction of server identity. One of the coolest things about WoW from when I started playing was wandering around cities like Dalaran and seeing realm-famous characters. Individual players had reputations, and in some cases even their alts were known. There was a sort of implied social contract to the game. If you were a jerk or a ninja looter, the rest of the people on your server would know about it, and it would affect your ability to play. The sense of community was strong because groups weren't full of random players with different servers hyphenated on the end of their names. A related change was sharding, introduced in Warlords of Draenor. It's a funky system, but basically the game will separate overpopulated areas in the game into copies, called shards, to balance out player counts. The end result is that players will run into other players from all sorts of other realms while they're out in the world. This irrevocably changes another social part of the game. I first played WoW in 2008, and one of the coolest parts of leveling a character back in the day was seeing the same players across different zones as you climb to max level. You might run into the same person in Durotar, Stranglethorn Vale, Nagrand, and Grizzly Hills. Seeing a player out in the world in the post-Warlords version of WoW is likely to be a one-off because of this system. It makes the world feel less alive, as the people within it, from any one person's perspective, are fleeting and transient. If the social angle is not appealing as a solution, how about some of the in-game features that have been changed or updated and then abandoned or reverted? One of them was the talent tree changes in Mists of Pandaria. Instead of full trees that were filled out with points earned every level, talents were put into tiers that unlocked at level thresholds, and players picked 1 out of 3 on each row. They dramatically simplified the talent process at the expense of personalization and fine-tuning. I much prefer the choice to mess around with the options available in a classical tree style, but I understand where Blizzard was coming from with this change. A majority of players just opt for cookie-cutter builds anyway, yet the talent trees were a significant part of customization, and part of what makes WoW an RPG. It's better to leave those choices with the people. Another feature that ended up being temporary but was impactful in its time were garrisons from Warlords of Draenor. For nearly 2 years, the central city hub was more of an afterthought, because players could do most of everything they needed in these self-contained bases. They were isolating and didn't feel alive, despite all of the NPCs working for and around the player. Some of the features were interesting, but this idea missed the mark. Blizzard reworked or removed these concepts, but they definitely were significant changes to the game in their time. The case for them is weaker because they came full circle, but at the time, these changes felt seismic. What about the major change to collections that occurred in Mist of Pandaria to make most mounts and achievements account-wide instead of specific to single characters? My assumption here is that only the most dedicated purist thinks this change was bad, but it might represent a core component that changed and made WoW new to a subset of people. I don't share this view, but I can understand the point. Things like titles and rare mounts added to the lore of a character, showing off player expertise or commitment to acquiring something other players weren't dedicated enough to grind. A perfect example are the Undying and Immortal titles from Wrath of the Lich King's Naxxramas. Though they are no longer obtainable, players who earned them before they were removed are able to use them for any character on their account. Maybe they raided as a Fury Warrior during that raid tier, but now they can use that reward on their new main character, a Resto Shaman. Does this take away from the prestige of having earned it? Collections becoming player-centric instead of character-centric changed a key element of the RPG aspect of WoW. Was it enough to tip the game into some new evolution? At this point, it's possible I've hit on enough changes that people would be satisfied with the solution. Bear with me though, I have a few more places where the game changed that I think are worth discussing. If you're still with me, I think I'm safe to assume you're an actual WoW player, which means you're familiar with the term borrowed power. These expansion, and sometimes even patch-specific systems, are a method Blizzard has used to grant players new progression not tied directly to leveling up. As implied by the name, these new abilities and passives got taken away in future updates. These began with artifact weapons in Legion, but gear corruptions and Covenant abilities are further examples. This concept is significant to how the game works, and an underrated part of why some people may feel that WoW is now a different game. Players always needed to re-gear their characters with new items, gems, enchants, and consumables when new content came out. But the idea of losing something that was worked for and earned is antithetical to the idea of character progression. The last esoteric element I think you could make a case for is weak auras. I confess not being well versed in the history of this add-on, but you can see how much it dominates the game if you watch it played at a high level. The Race to World First is a showcase of the ingenuity of the teams involved as they work on the cutting edge to make the hardest PvE content in the game manageable enough to conquer. WoW is an old game now, and the average skill of the player base has climbed dramatically over time. This has necessitated an increase in the complexity of PvE encounters, and weak auras help to alleviate the mental strain of gameplay. A simpler answer to the Ship of Theseus is that maybe World of Warcraft became a completely new game in January of 2007. This time marked the end of the original game and the launch of the first expansion, the Burning Crusade. There was a new level cap, new stats, and new playable races and professions. Alliance players could be shamans, and Horde players could be paladins. The adventure departed from Azeroth with the opening of the Dark Portal to Outland, a new region where it was possible to take to the skies. This expansion is one of the most fondly remembered in the long history of WoW. Were the changes drastic enough to consider it a new game? Don't forget that for many people, the answer to the Ship of Theseus experiment is likely a combination of multiple things. Some of the changes to WoW have been large, and some have been small. Where someone draws the line between an old, nostalgic version of Warcraft and what it is today is a matter for endless debate. It's probably entirely defined by when they first discovered the game and their first experiences learning about the world. Priorities and gameplay also have an impact. I didn't touch on much to do with PvP, but there are times when that changed that players may consider the answer to this question, such as when 5v5s were retired, or Bloodlust and Heroism were banned. Even if the ship, or game in this case, has changed enough to be new, what matters is whether the player still enjoys playing. The beauty is that Warcraft is a different game for everyone. WoW is undeniably a radically different game today than it used to be in the past, even the recent past. Yet it's still exactly what you make of it. The room to explore and interact with the things that have changed over the years is part of the adventure and a reason for its longevity.